Hello YouTube, this is umills03. So in this video, I wanted to go ahead and talk about arrays. So basically what an array is it's a type of data structure that allows you to hold multiple elements as long as they're the same data type. And so data structures are helpful if we're trying to store a lot of information, right? Because you could have individual int variables or double variables, but each of those variables can only hold one piece of information. So what you could do is keep track of an array that held 6,000 ints, and then it would just go ahead and just be able to hold a much more massive amount of information at the same time. And then what we're going to do is we're going to be able to access elements in the array by their index position. So we think of an array as basically being a data structure with a fixed length, and we're going to mandate how many elements it has when we first create it, and then it's going to have that fixed number of elements, then we should be able to access elements in the array whenever we'd like to. So let me show you some of the functionality. Let me show you how we get started with arrays, because now that we understand while loops and for loops, it's going to be a helpful technique for us to be able to iterate through the arrays and quickly print the values that exist within them. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with a clean main method. There's not going to be any code here to begin with, but what we're going to do is make some notes. So an array is a data structure that holds multiple elements of the same data type, okay? And so we can access elements in an array by calling their index positions, okay? So arrays have index positions, and those are basically just integers that refer to the position of elements within the array. So we would say for an array with 5 elements, the proper index positions are 0, 1, 2, 3, or 4. So if we have a double array, right, we're talking about an array of floating point numbers called list, then list of 0, list of 1, list of 2, list of 3, and list of 4 should be 4 floating point numbers. And so hopefully you understand um, the 5 floating point numbers, right? So hopefully you understand basically what's going on with that. So now let's talk about how to initialize an array and what default values will be in an array unless we declare something otherwise. So what you're going to do to create an array is you need to specify first the data type that the array is going to hold in it. So if you wanted it to be an array of ints, you would go ahead and say int array, and then you can call it whatever you want, but you're going to go ahead and have square brackets. So you would say int and then square brackets, and then the name of the array. And then if you want to initialize an empty array, so if you want to basically initialize a default blank array, what you're going to do is you're going to basically say equals new, and then the data type again, and then whatever size you want to do. So basically what this does is it creates an array with 6 integers, okay? And what we're going to say is that for an int array, the values are defaulted to 0 unless we change them, okay? So what you could do is you could say system.out.println of 250 plus array of 5, okay? And so what this would do is it would add the last element in the array, the element at index position 5, to the number 250, and we should be expecting 250 because we said that by default the values would be 0. Okay, so 250 plus 0 is 0. Those are the default values for an int array, right? And so that's essentially what you would get. What if we tried saying system.out.println of array of 6? Is it possible to call array of 6? And the answer is no. We said that if an array has 6 elements, then the valid index positions go from 0 to 5. So now if we go ahead and compile this and run it, we would have basically what's called an exception. And we're going to be talking about exceptions much later in the curriculum, but this says that the index 6 is out of bounds for length 6. And of course, the same kind of thing would happen if we went ahead and stuck in a negative index position, right? You're going to get the same kind of error. So obviously it needs to be between 0 and length minus 1. If you want to know the number of elements that an array can hold, because we said that once an array gets created, it's going to get a length attached to it, and that's the length for the rest of its life. So if you want to figure out the number of elements in an array, what you could do is you would call the length property on a particular array object. So you would say array.length And then this would give you the 6 there. This would give you the number of elements that you have in your array. So that would be 6. Let's talk about a double array, because this is assuming that you would just be putting integers into your array. What if you want to put doubles? So what do you think the default value of a double would be? So what we're going to do, all we're going to do is change this to be an array of 6 floating point numbers. So we would say creates an array with 6 floating point numbers. And then what we're going to do is we're going to say for a double array, the values are defaulted to 0.0. Okay, so now what if you say what if you say system.out.println of array.length plus array of 0? So what is it going to do? Well, here we're going to have an implicit cast because array.length returns an int, but we said if we add an int to a double, and now this array is made up of doubles, then the int is going to be automatically converted to a double. So if we're adding 6 to 0.0, we should be getting 6.0, and indeed that's what we see on the console. What about an array of booleans? So we learned in lessons 8 and 9 about booleans, and we said booleans can only take on 2 possible values. It turns out that if you create an array of booleans, the default value is going to be false. So what if we go ahead and say boolean array equals new boolean of 6? And this is just a data structure that can hold 6 expressions, each of which are either true or false, right? Objective pieces of information that are either true or false, right? So this would create an array with 6 false values by default, okay? And you can change them if you want. But if you said system.out.println of array of 2, it would go ahead and say false, and we can verify that. So we would say the values are defaulted to false for a Boolean array. And then what we could do is we could say something like false or array of 2. So what does this code do? Well, basically, we know that if we combine false and we say false or some other Boolean, then it just evaluates that other Boolean, right? Because false is not gonna, it's not gonna be a disqualifier here, but it's also not gonna help us get to the true. So the only way that this could be true is if array of 2 is true. And what I'm saying is that that's gonna be false because the values are defaulted to false. So indeed, that's what you would get for that combined Boolean expression. What if you wanted to go ahead and change values after you've already created an array? So you can certainly do that. What you could do is you could say int list equals new int of 4, right? And so that would create a list with 4 elements in it. And then what you could do is you could say list of 0 is equal to 2, list of 1 is equal to 2, list of 2 is equal, you could say list of 3 equals list of 0 plus list of 1. So let's figure out what the elements in this array are going to be after we perform these steps. And what we're going to do is we're going to iterate through the array with a while loop or a for loop and print the values of the array. So what this does is it creates an array with 4 zeros. We said that those are the default values for an int array, just like the default values for a double array are 0.0 and the default values for a Boolean array are false. And then what does this do? It reassigns the element at index position 0 to a 2. So now we have 2, 0, 0, 0, and we need to go ahead and put that in a comment. And then it's going to change the element at index position 1. So now you're talking about 2, 1, 0, 0. And then it's going to reassign the element at index position 3 to the sum of the elements at index positions 0 and 1. And so 2 plus 10 is 12. So we should have essentially comment and then 2, 1, 0, 12. And so there's different ways that we can verify that those are the 4 numbers that we're going to get if we try printing this array. And I'm going to show you the methods for doing that. The first thing you could do is a while loop, and we've seen this ever since lesson 12. So hopefully you're starting to see more examples of this and it's becoming clearer. So you would come up basically with a counting variable with a variable which is going to be able to step through the array and print each of the elements in it. So you're going to say while counter is still less than the length of the array. So it's still less than list.length, right? Because you remember we have this property .length that we can call on an array to return the number of elements in the array. And then you would simply be saying system.out.println of list of counter, right? Because you'd be looking at the element in the list at index position counter. And then you just need to remember to increment counter, because otherwise you're going to stay at counter equals 0 and nothing's going to change, and Java is going to create an infinite amount of work for itself. So hopefully we'll be able to see the elements, the 2, 1, 0, 12. Hopefully this is all making sense to you conceptually. And now if we go ahead and run the main method, then we go ahead and get 2, 1, I think I accidentally said 1 up here, right? But it should be 2, 10, 0, 12, right? So that's just a little typo. but those were the values that we were expecting. So hopefully that makes sense to you. We can also pass values into an array immediately. And we do that with curly braces, okay? So if you're gonna go ahead and create an array of doubles, what you could do is you could just set an array of doubles equal to some curly braces where the double elements are gonna be separated by commas, and then you can arbitrarily have as many as you want. So let me do it, let me show you a couple of examples. Let's create an array of string objects. So I'm gonna say string words, and then what I'm going to do from this point is basically there's two ways that I could create this string array. I could either create an empty string array where I just say string words equals new string of 5, right? And then it will be up to me to decide what strings are going to go into these index positions, because right now they would just be null. So there's not really like full concrete string objects at those index positions yet. It's not like int and double and boolean, which get default values. There's not really a default string. It just basically returns this non-object. It's called null. But anyway, what I'm saying is that there's another way to go ahead and create an array, and that's to just use these curly braces. So you either create a blank array, and then you can sort of change the values at your leisure, or you can just go ahead and have custom values right from the beginning. So you could go ahead and say something like June, and then you could say August, and then you could say swimming, right? Swimming, right? And then you could go ahead and say summer, and then how about barbecue, right? And then what you could do is you could go ahead and iterate and use an array to iterate through the elements in this list and print each of them, right? And so this would give you an example of how this works. What you would do is you could say for int k equals 0, k is less than words.length, or we could practice using a break. So let's go ahead and say k is greater than -2, right? This is an example of a Boolean that would always be true if k is just going to start at k equals 0 and go up from there. All it's going to do is start at k equals 0 and increase from there. So this Boolean is always going to be true. So we're going to say if k gets to the point of being equal to the length of that array, we need to get out of this loop, because otherwise we're going to have an index out of bounds exception like we saw at the beginning of the video. But then if we don't break out, then what we would be doing is we would basically just say system.out.println of words of k, and then it's just going to print the string object at index position k for each value of k until words.length, because you start at 0 and go up to words.length, and then you're going to manually break out of the loop. So now if we go ahead and run the code, we basically print the elements of the array. We're going to do another example, and I'm going to show you one more type of loop that is really, really robust and helpful and clean if you're talking about iterating through an array. And it's called a for each loop. So what we're going to do is we've done this with ints, we've done this with strings, we could do this with either booleans or doubles. Okay, let's go ahead and do it with booleans. Okay, so we could call it we could call it logic or something, call it whatever you want, and you're just going to feed booleans into here. Okay, so what you're going to do is you're just going to feed booleans. So false, true, true, false, true, true. Okay, it's just an array of 6 booleans, which has now been initialized, which is now which now has custom values. And it's totally okay to change values even after you create an array like this. Okay, so what if you want to say logic of 0 is equal to not logic of 0? So what this does is it flips the Boolean value at index position 0 of the logic array. So now logic of 0, so now we would say logic of 0 will give a true value. Okay, and so hopefully that's clear to you how that works. But then just to make sure that it does, we could say if logic of 0, and then we could demonstrate the functionality of the for each loop within. Because now if logic of 0 is going to be made the opposite of logic of 0, then logic of 0 is going to go from false to true, and everything in this if statement is going to run. So you can see how we're putting concepts together. What I want to do is I want to print each of the elements in this array. So what I'm going to do is I'm basically going to go ahead and say for each Boolean u in logic, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say system, and we're going to explain what this means, but I would say system.out.println of u. Okay, so this is an example of a for loop, or for each loop, and the way that it works is if you're okay iterating through every single element in the list, what it would do is it sort of arbitrarily references each element according to the data type that it is, okay? So if you're iterating through an array of Booleans, then you would say for Boolean and then come up with a variable, any arbitrary variable that you name that you want. But then this is going to be like a local variable name where you're just going to arbitrarily call something that will refer to each element in the array. So this says for each of the Boolean variables in the logic array, which I'm arbitrarily going to refer to each of those Boolean variables as u, I just want you to go ahead and print u. So now what this would do is if you go ahead and compile this code and you run it, then it would go ahead and print the 6 values of the array. So it would be true, 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 false, true, true. Now remember when we created the array, it was false, true, true, false, true, true. But then remember with this line of code, we made logic of 0, true, which enables this code to run to begin with. Okay, so then if you have an else statement, right? If you have an else statement, you say system.out.println of didn't work, right? And so you would basically be running the if code if logic of 0 was a true Boolean. So if you go ahead and compile this and you run it, then you would get those Booleans. But then what if you had said if not logic of 0, right? Because now logic of 0 is true, so not logic of 0 is false. So then it's going to run the else code instead. So now instead of printing all those true and false values, you would just print didn't work. And then of course the other print statements that we had from previous examples. So the for each loop is really nice if you're just going to go ahead and iterate through each element in the array list, because what would you have written if you didn't do this for each loop? How much longer would your code have been? You would have needed to say basically for int u equals 0, right? And these are redundant, right? You can't call u both a Boolean and an int right next to each other like that, but you would say for int u equals 0, and then you'd say for u is less than logic.length, and then u plus plus. And then you would basically be saying system.out.println of logic of u. But you can see how that's just already a little bit more code. So if you're trying to iterate through each of the elements, you could just go ahead and do a for each loop. What if you just wanted to print the first 3 elements? So what if you just wanted to print the first 3 elements of an array, but you wanted to use a for each loop to do it? So you're going to say int array equals, and then you can do 82, 75, 77, 80, 83, 89. What if I just wanted to print the first 3 values of the array? Sometimes with the for each loop, it's a little hard to figure out how you could just do something to some of the values, but not to other values, because it seems like it's just going to arbitrarily call each of the elements in the array, right? Every single one of them. So what you could do is you could come up with a variable where once the variable reaches a certain value, you would know that you're at an index position where you want to break out of the for each loop. So just like we can have a break and continue for a while or for loop, same thing happens with the for each loop. So you would say in s equals 0, and then the goal cut off after printing the first 3 numbers of array. So then what you would do is you would say for each of the numbers in array, and then what you would do is you would basically say system.out.println. You could go ahead and increment. So you would say basically if s gets to 3, right? If s gets to 3, you would want to break out of this loop. But otherwise, you could go ahead and print the number, and then you would need to go ahead and increment s so that eventually this Boolean would become true. And so what this code would have the effect of doing is just printing the first 3 numbers in the array. And so that just gives you an example of how you can still use a for each loop if you only want to print some of the elements. But remember to use this powerful, Boolean technique to your advantage. The idea that you could break out of a loop prematurely on account of some Boolean being true. So now if you go ahead and compile this and you run this, then indeed we just get those first 3 numbers, right? So hopefully that's clear to you with what's going on. What if we had said, if s equals 0, continue? What if we had said continue here? Well, that would have been fine, and then we just don't print the first element. But then if you're going to continue, it would skip the increment of s from 0 to 1. So then you would have to increment s from 0 to 1 right off the bat, and then you could continue it. So this would have the effect of just printing the second and the third numbers. So it would just print 75 and 77. So that kind of gives you an idea of arrays, how to initialize them, how to change the values of them, how to reassign values in them. And then we can use any of the three arrays now, the three loops now rather, that we've studied to iterate and print the values of them or do other things to the array. So go ahead and practice that, because we're going to certainly be using arrays for the rest of the Java curriculum. So from UMills03, thanks for watching, and please subscribe.